November fog had rolled in thick over St. Aldwyth's, blurring the edges of the small coastal town into a smudge of grey. Lamps along the main street glowed like pale lanterns in a dream, their light swallowed just a few feet from the source. It was in this muffled world that the most perplexing case in the memory of the place would begin, one that the local constable, a man with more experience finding lost sheep than solving serious crimes, would later confess felt like chasing a shadow in a dream. The trouble started in the early hours of a Sunday morning, when Dr. Lionel Carter was found dead in his private consulting room above the apothecary on Hawthorne Lane. The door had been locked from the inside. The single narrow window, giving out onto the slate rooftops of the neighbouring buildings, was latched. The fire in the small grate had burned low but steady, and nothing in the room suggested a struggle. There was no sign of forced entry, no scattered papers, no overturned furniture, only the doctor himself slumped in his armchair, his spectacles still balanced on the bridge of his nose, and a curious, almost serene expression upon his face. It was that expression that first troubled those who saw him. Not the slack features of someone felled by a sudden stroke, nor the taut grimace of pain, but the faintest upward curve of the lips, as though he had died in the middle of a pleasant thought. The official cause of death was not immediately clear. The constable, uneasy, called for the town's only other physician, Doctor Pembroke, who after a brief examination declared that there were no obvious injuries, no marks of violence. But when he checked the pulse and looked closely into Carter's eyes, he frowned. There was a strange dilation to the pupils. Then there was the matter of the object in his right hand, a small silver key on a fine chain. Not a door key, as it was far too small, and not the sort for a diary or writing desk either. The constable asked Dr. Pembroke if he knew what it might open. The doctor shook his head, though his hesitation before answering was noted by more than one observer. When the room was searched, they found nothing that matched it. The desk was unlocked, the drawers containing only the usual correspondence, patient notes, and an assortment of oddly meticulous sketches, drawings of eyes, each from a different angle, all rendered in painstaking detail. There was no safe, no box, no cabinet requiring a key of that size. More unsettling still was a notebook found in the inside pocket of Carter's waistcoat. Its pages were filled with precise, slanted handwriting, but no medical records. Instead, it contained what appeared to be transcripts of dreams, some his own, others apparently taken from patients, though none were signed with names. Dreams of staircases that ended in water, of music played in rooms without doors, of endless corridors lined with mirrors. One entry was dated the night before, his death. I stood in a garden of white poppies. The air was thick with their scent, and somewhere a bell was tolling, though I could not find the tower. When Miss Marple happened to arrive in St. Aldwyth's the next morning, it was by pure coincidence. She had been invited to stay with her old friend Mrs. Lathbury, who had moved to the coast for her health. Over tea and a slice of seed cake, Mrs. Lathbury mentioned in hushed tones that something dreadful had happened to the doctor. By the time the story was finished, Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap, her eyes sharp despite the gentle smile that rarely left her face. The locked room alone was curious enough, but it was the combination of elements that drew her interest: the unmarked body, the mysterious key, the book of dreams. She remarked, almost to herself, that people rarely write down dreams unless they think them important, and doctors, she added, are very careful about the things they keep locked away, be it medicines, money, or secrets. Miss Marple's curiosity was not long in being satisfied. She went for a walk through the fog-veiled streets, ending, quite naturally, outside the apothecary. The constable, a stout man named Jarvis, stood at the door, looking as though he'd much rather be anywhere else. She asked in her mild way after the case, and Jarvis, unused to strangers who seemed to listen so well, found himself explaining that they could not work out how anyone had got in or out. The doctor's rooms were reached by a narrow flight of stairs at the back of the shop, which had been locked when they found him. No one downstairs had heard a thing. "And the key?" Miss Marple asked, as if it were a matter of no great importance. "Still a puzzle," Jarvis admitted. "Doesn't seem to fit anything in the place, and there's no sign of theft. His money's still in his wallet, watch still on his wrist." "Curious," she murmured. People don't usually die holding something without reason, and dreams, Constable, are not often written down in such detail unless the dreamer means to remember them or share them. Jarvis looked at her blankly, but Miss Marple had already turned her gaze toward the mist-shrouded rooftops, as if seeing a pattern invisible to anyone else. That afternoon, she learned from Mrs. Lathbury that Dr. Carter had been something of an oddity in the town. He had a reputation for listening more than he spoke, and some patients claimed he could tell them what they had dreamt the night before. "Nonsense, of course," Mrs. Lathbury said briskly, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Though I did hear he studied in Vienna, with some fellow who thought dreams meant something." Miss Marple said nothing, but the idea settled quietly into her thoughts. That night the fog thickened until the town seemed like an island adrift in grey. Somewhere far off, a bell did toll, faint but distinct, and Miss Marple, lying awake in her guest room, wondered not only who had killed Dr. Carter, but why the murder seemed less like an act of violence than the closing of a chapter in some strange, hidden story. By morning, the town was buzzing with speculation, suicide, poison, some foreign illness, but none of these quite explained the locked room, the missing lock for the silver key, or why a respected doctor had been chronicling dreams as if they were matters of life and death. And Miss Marple, sipping her tea, resolved that before she left St. Aldwith's, she would find the answer. For in her experience there was no such thing as a clue that meant nothing, and in this case she suspected the smallest detail, the shape of a key, the choice of a flower in a dream, might unlock the truth. Miss Marple's first morning in St. Aldwith's was marked by the sound of hurried footsteps outside Mrs. Lathbury's front door. Through the lace curtains she saw Constable Jarvis passing by, his hat pulled low against the wind, clutching a bundle of papers under one arm. Mrs. Lathbury, carrying in the breakfast tray, remarked that he had the look of a man chasing his own tail. "It's always the same when something dreadful happens," she said, setting down the teapot. "They rush about looking busy, but it's the wrong sort of busy. Not the kind that gets answers." Miss Marple, buttering her toast, smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear. Much activity, little progress. It's rather like stirring porridge. You can keep at it for hours and still have nothing more than you began with." After breakfast, she made her way to the apothecary again, this time under the pretext of purchasing lavender salve for Mrs. Lathbury's rheumatism. The shop was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of dried herbs and camphor. Behind the counter, young Agnes Webb was measuring powders into small paper packets. She was pale, her hands quick and efficient, but her eyes darted toward the stairs at the back whenever the door creaked. "Such a sad thing about the doctor," Miss Marple said softly, accepting a parcel. "You must have worked closely with him." Agnes gave a quick nod, but her fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. "Yes, ma'am. He was very particular. Always kept to his own rooms upstairs after hours. Didn't like to be disturbed." "Even by you?" A hesitation, too long to be natural. "Well, yes, even by me. He said it was important work." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the girl for a moment longer. The nervousness was there, but not grief exactly. Something more guarded, as though Agnes were afraid of saying too much. When the constable came in a moment later, carrying a small brown envelope, he greeted Miss Marple with a polite nod and asked to speak with Agnes. She excused herself, but as she slipped into the back room, Miss Marple caught the faintest sound of an intake of breath, almost as if the girl had been bracing herself. Jarvis, bustling as ever, admitted that they'd found another odd thing in the doctor's desk, a slip of paper folded into a square, tucked between two ledger pages. It contained a single word, Ariadne. "A name?" Miss Marple asked. "Seems like it. Could be a patient, but there's no record in his books. Might be foreign." Miss Marple considered this. Ariadne, the one who gave Theseus the thread in the old story. A useful sort of person to have in a maze. Jarvis blinked at her, clearly unfamiliar with the myth, and muttered that he'd check the post office for any letters addressed to such a name. But Miss Marple was already thinking of the dreams in the notebook. Gardens, corridors, staircases. Mazes, perhaps. Later that day, she paid a visit to the rooms above the apothecary. Jarvis allowed her a quick look, provided she didn't touch anything official. Miss Marple moved slowly, as though admiring the arrangement of the furniture, but her eyes were sharp, cataloguing details. The doctor's chair still faced the fire, the small silver key on the side table where they'd placed it after removing it from his hand. She noticed the ashtray beside it, empty except for a single, half-burnt match. There was no sign of a candle in the room, and the gaslight over the desk worked perfectly well. Why, then, had he struck a match? She wandered toward the desk, careful not to disturb the papers. A faint smudge of ash clung to the inside lip of the top drawer where the dreams had been stored. A burnt scrap, a letter destroyed before his death, or perhaps the remains of something he wished to hide. It was near the window that she found the most telling thing. The sill was free of dust, save for a small oval mark, as if something had stood there recently and been removed. A jar, perhaps, or a bottle. The window was latched, but the catch looked newly polished, unlike the dull brass of the rest of the fittings. When she mentioned it to Jarvis, he shrugged. "Could have been cleaned. We've been in and out since yesterday." "Perhaps," she said mildly, but she thought it odd that the polishing extended only to the catch itself, not the surrounding wood. Someone had handled it quite a bit, and recently. As they left the room, Miss Marple glanced once more at the silver key. Her mind, well practised in the habits of the sly and the deceitful, told her that the key was meant to be seen. There was a difference between an object dropped in haste and one carefully placed. She had the uncomfortable feeling that whoever had killed Dr. Carter wanted the police to fixate on that key, and perhaps on the dreams, while something more practical went unnoticed. That evening, she called again on Mrs. Lathbury, who had heard the latest talk from the fishmonger's wife. Apparently, a stranger had been seen in town the day before the death, a tall man in a dark coat carrying a leather case, who had asked for directions to Hawthorne Lane. No one had seen him leave. Miss Marple tucked this away in her mind. Visitors came and went in towns like this, often without notice, but a man with a case suggested business, and in her experience the more discreet the visit, the more dangerous its purpose. The next morning she returned to the apothecary, this time finding Agnes alone. Miss Marple asked, as if in passing, whether Dr. Carter had ever mentioned the name Ariadne. The girl froze for a fraction of a second before answering, "No, ma'am." It was the kind of denial that was too quick, too neat. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was light. "Oh, I must have misheard the constable, then." A silly thing to remember. She spoke of other matters for a while before leaving, but as she stepped into the street she was certain of one thing. Agnes Webb knew more than she dared to say. It was not yet enough for proof, but the pattern was forming. There was deception in this case, and it was in the small, almost invisible reactions. A catch polished to brightness, a half-burnt match, a young woman's reflexive denial. Somewhere among these fragments lay the thread that would lead her out of the maze, and Miss Marple, having once taken hold of a thread, never let go. The weather turned overnight. By morning, the fog had thinned into a pale drizzle that slicked the cobbles and drummed lightly against the windows of the apothecary. Constable Jarvis had gathered 3 people in the small parlour behind the shop. Their accounts, he said, might help untangle the doctor's final hours. Miss Marple, though not officially part of the proceedings, found herself quietly present, knitting in hand, her eyes flicking from one speaker to another with a bird-like attentiveness. First was Agnes Webb, the young assistant. She sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, and answered Jarvis's questions in a voice carefully measured. She claimed that on the evening of the doctor's death she had left the shop at 7:30, locking the front door as usual. Dr. Carter had already gone upstairs, and she hadn't seen him again. "You're certain he spoke to no one after you left?" Jarvis asked. "Yes, sir. Not that I saw." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And you didn't hear anything? A knock, perhaps, or footsteps on the stairs?" Agnes's eyes shifted slightly before she answered, "No, ma'am. Nothing at all." It was neatly said, but there was a faint tremor on the word nothing, as though she were pushing the truth into shape. Miss Marple tucked away the observation, making no sign she had noticed. The second witness was Mr. Harold Finch, the grocer whose shop sat opposite the apothecary. A florid man with a tendency to lean forward as he spoke, Finch was eager, too eager, Miss Marple thought, to prove his usefulness. "I was closing up about 8 o'clock, he said, when I saw a fellow go up the lane. Tall chap, long coat, carrying a case. Not a face I knew. He stopped outside the apothecary, looked up at the windows, then went in the back way. "You're certain about the time?" Jarvis asked. "Oh, yes, very certain," Finch replied with a nod that was almost theatrical. "I'd just finished counting the till, and my wife called me to help carry in the flour sacks. Can't mistake it." Miss Marple asked gently, "Did you see him leave?" Finch paused for half a beat. "No, ma'am. Funny thing that. I went inside for the flour and didn't look out again until after past. By then, the lane was empty." It was a tidy answer, perhaps too tidy, and she wondered whether Finch was conscious of what he left unsaid. The third person was Mrs. Clara Baines, a patient of Dr. Carter's who lived 2 streets over. She had come forward claiming she'd passed by the apothecary late that evening. Her manner was brisk and a little defensive, as though already anticipating disbelief. "I saw the light in his upstairs room about 9:15, she said. "He was standing at the window looking out, seemed deep in thought." "Was he alone?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Baines said quickly. Then, almost as an afterthought, "though I might have seen someone's shadow move behind him. Could have been a trick of the light." Miss Marple caught the small hesitation, the moment in which Mrs. Baines had debated whether to mention the shadow at all. When the questioning was done, Jarvis declared he would check the railway station for any trace of the mysterious tall man. The witnesses drifted away, and Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, remarked, "It is remarkable, is it not, how 3 people can look at the same evening and see quite different things?" Jarvis grunted. "One of 'em's lying, you think?" "Oh, my dear constable," she said mildly, "they may all be telling the truth, as they choose to remember it. Memory is a curious thing. We often tidy it up without knowing." But in her own mind she was less charitable. Agnes had smoothed over something. Finch had embellished, perhaps to make himself appear important. Mrs. Baines had seen more than she was willing to admit. That afternoon Miss Marple took a slow walk through the town, her umbrella tapping lightly against the stones. She stopped by the grocer's under the pretext of buying tea. Finch served her with hearty cheer, asking if she'd heard the latest gossip, that the police believed the stranger had come from the London train. "Mark my words," he said, leaning over the counter. "There's always trouble when outsiders turn up." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet, Mr. Finch, trouble often comes from quite close to home. One needn't travel far to find it." She saw the flicker in his eyes, a momentary retreat, before he chuckled and busied himself with the till. From there, she called on Mrs. Baines. Over tea, she steered the conversation back to that shadow in the window. Mrs. Baines insisted it was nothing, but her gaze slid toward the mantel clock as she spoke, as though measuring her words against the time they were said. "I wouldn't like to accuse anyone," she finished, "and the doctor had his odd ways. Always did." "Odd in what way?" "Oh, secretive, kept late hours. And those dreams of his, wrote them down as if they were gospel truth. My nephew told me he once asked a man to come back and describe a dream in detail. Not right, if you ask me." By the time Miss Marple left, she had formed the impression that Mrs. Baines's dislike of the doctor was personal, though she could not yet say why. The most interesting conversation of the day, however, came from Agnes. Miss Marple found her in the shop's storeroom folding brown paper. She spoke casually at first, about the weather and the inconvenience of damp mornings. Then, lowering her voice, she asked, "Did the constable say if they'd found anything else?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Why do you ask, my dear?" Agnes hesitated, fingers stilling on the paper. "Because, well, there was a box, a small one, kept in his desk, always locked. I didn't see it yesterday when they were searching. A box with a keyhole the size of the one you found in his hand." Agnes's eyes widened. "You've seen it?" She seemed about to say more, then pressed her lips together. "I shouldn't have mentioned it." Miss Marple, with a kind nod, said nothing further. But inside, her thoughts quickened. A missing locked box, a key placed deliberately in the dead man's hand, witnesses whose accounts did not quite align. These were not separate mysteries, but parts of the same design. The deception was there, woven through each story like a thread in the weave. All that remained was to follow it to its end. and as she stepped out into the drizzle, Miss Marple was certain of one thing. In St. Aldwith's, the truth was being spoken, just never all at once, and never in the same place. By the following morning, the rain had passed, leaving the air bright but sharp, the sort of weather that made details seem a little clearer. Miss Marple sat at Mrs. Lathbury's breakfast table, not so much eating as thinking, her mind turning over the fragments she had gathered, fitting and refitting them into possible patterns. The trouble was, the pieces seemed to belong to several different puzzles at once. Each of the people she had spoken to, Agnes Webb, Harold Finch, Mrs. Baines, had their own reasons to resent or fear Dr. Carter, though none seemed quite enough to explain his death alone. Yet taken together, the motives formed a dense, knotted tangle. Agnes, for instance, had worked under Carter for nearly 3 years. She was efficient, precise, and according to Mrs. Lathbury, underpaid for the amount of responsibility she carried. There were rumours, never voiced directly to Miss Marple, that Carter had kept certain medicines locked away, ones that could fetch a good price if one knew the right buyer. Agnes might have noticed such things going missing, or she might have taken them herself. And if that locked box she mentioned truly belonged to Carter and was now missing, then its absence could hardly be to her advantage unless she knew exactly what had been inside. Then there was Finch, the grocer. He had been quick to report seeing the mysterious stranger, which could mean he was being helpful, or that he was providing a diversion. Finch had a standing account with Carter, paying monthly for tonics his wife claimed helped her nerves. Miss Marple had learned from a quiet word with the postmistress that the grocer's accounts at the bank were strained. If Carter had refused to extend further credit or threatened to cut off his supplies, Finch might have had reason to wish the matter settled in a more permanent way. Mrs. Baines, on the other hand, had no financial connection to the doctor, at least none Miss Marple could uncover. But her dislike was evident, almost personal. She spoke of Carter's odd ways and strange ideas, and had admitted to seeing a shadow behind him in the window. She had also been overheard telling a neighbour that some men deserved a bit of what they gave out. That sort of bitterness rarely grew without cause. Miss Marple wondered whether a treatment had gone wrong, or if perhaps Carter had learned something about her she preferred to keep hidden. Then there was the stranger in the long coat. He was the most straightforward figure to suspect, an outsider, untraceable, arriving just before the death and vanishing immediately afterward. But such neatness was almost too convenient. It could be that the stranger was real and dangerous, or that he had been invented entirely, his story embroidered by Finch or encouraged by another who needed the town looking outward instead of inward. The missing box was the key, literally and figuratively. Without knowing what it had contained, any theory was guesswork. Drugs, money, documents, even the notebook of dreams could be linked to it. People sometimes hide the most personal records in locked boxes, especially if they hold secrets about others. Miss Marple decided it was time to hear from more than one source at once. She suggested to Constable Jarvis in her mild way that it might be useful to have all 3 local witnesses together under the same roof. "You'd be surprised," she said, "how often a person's story changes when they hear someone else's version." That afternoon they were assembled again in the parlour, Agnes in her neat dark dress, Finch in his shop apron, and Mrs. Baines with her hat still pinned firmly in place. Miss Marple settled in a corner chair, her knitting moving briskly while Jarvis began with harmless questions about the evening of the doctor's death. It didn't take long for the differences to appear. Finch insisted again that the stranger had gone in the back way, and Mrs. Baines promptly said she'd never seen anyone go toward that door in her life. Agnes, pale but composed, interjected that the back door was usually locked after 6, unless Carter had opened it himself. "Then you think he did let someone in?" Jarvis asked. "I didn't say that," Agnes replied quickly. "I only said it would be locked unless he chose otherwise." Miss Marple glanced up just in time to see Mrs. Baines's lips tighten, as if she had been about to speak but thought better of it. The conversation circled like a cat around cream. Finch grew more emphatic about the stranger. Mrs. Baines became more certain the shadow she'd seen was probably nothing at all, and Agnes said very little, her eyes fixed on her hands. Miss Marple said almost nothing, merely observing how each of them reacted when another spoke. When Jarvis dismissed them, Miss Marple followed Finch out into the lane, remarking in a friendly tone that it was odd for him to have noticed so much about the stranger's arrival, yet nothing about his departure. He chuckled nervously. "Oh, I'm not saying he didn't leave. Just that I wasn't looking," but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. Later, Miss Marple found Agnes in the storeroom again. Without preamble, she said, "My dear, if you know where that missing box is, now is the time to tell someone you can trust." Agnes's lips parted, but she shook her head. "I don't. I only know he kept it hidden. He never even let me dust that drawer, and once—" She stopped herself, then finished reluctantly. "Once I saw him put a letter in it. He looked frightened." This was the first mention of fear. Dr. Carter had been secretive, perhaps even eccentric, but no one else had hinted at him being afraid of anything. By evening, Miss Marple had built a mental map of connections. Agnes knew about the locked box and had seen it used. Finch could have invented or exaggerated the stranger's visit to provide an explanation for the death, or to hide his own movements. Mrs. Baines had seen a shadow and disliked the doctor enough to avoid telling the full truth. The web was there, but not yet tightened. The motives, money, resentment, secrecy, overlapped without forming a single line from cause to crime. The missing box was the centre of the maze, and every path, however winding, seemed to lead back to it. Miss Marple knew that in such cases the truth was often not the grand theory that explained everything at once, but the small, solid fact that made one story impossible. Somewhere among the half-truths she had heard was that fact, and once she found it, the maze would begin to clear. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the streets of Wethercombe slick and gleaming. Detective Hartley stood in the station's incident room, staring at the corkboard where photographs, notes, and timelines sprawled like an unsolvable puzzle. For 3 days, he'd sifted through conflicting accounts and shifting motives. But now, the room buzzed with a nervous energy that wasn't his doing. "Sir," Constable Avery called from his desk, his voice tight with restrained excitement. The lab results came back from that monogrammed handkerchief found near the lane. Hartley turned slowly. "And?" "It's got traces of Mr. Gratham's cologne and his blood type. More than that, it matches the fibres from his overcoat. Looks like he was at the scene, sir." A low murmur spread through the small room. Gratham, the wealthy shipping magnate with the impeccable reputation, had already been under quiet suspicion. He'd been evasive in interviews, his answers wrapped in charm but lacking substance. Now the evidence, at least on paper, was damning. Hartley's brow furrowed. "Where exactly was the handkerchief found?" Avery shuffled his notes. "Wedged under a bramble bush near where the victim's body was first spotted. Likely dropped in the struggle. Or placed there," Hartley thought, but he kept it to himself. By midday, the station was in an uproar. The chief superintendent had decided the press should be told they had a significant development. The words "case closed" weren't yet spoken, but the implication was clear. Hartley accompanied Sergeant Vale to Gratham's estate. The great iron gates creaked open, revealing a long gravel drive lined with dripping elms. Gratham met them in the drawing-room, dressed in a tailored suit, his expression composed. Too composed. "I understand this is about the dreadful business in town," he said, gesturing toward the decanter of sherry as though they'd come for afternoon drinks. Hartley declined. "Mr. Gratham, we've found an item linking you directly to the scene." Gratham's gaze flickered for only a fraction of a second before his lips curved faintly. "A handkerchief? I have dozens. I must have lost it somewhere in the village last week. This one has your cologne, your blood type, and fibres matching your coat." Vale's voice was sharp, certain. Gratham chuckled softly. "My dear Sergeant, I supply that particular coat fabric to several tailors. And as for the cologne, it is hardly exclusive." Hartley studied him. There was no sign of panic, no protests of innocence, no outrage, just a measured calm, as if Gratham had expected this moment. Back at the station, the arrest went ahead. Photographers swarmed the gates, their bulbs flashing as Gratham was led to the car, his chin raised like a man on parade. By evening, headlines blared, "Local businessman held in murder case." The chief superintendent held a brief press conference, offering phrases like "solid forensic evidence" and "swift justice." Hartley stayed behind in the dimly lit incident room, the walls closing in around him. He should have felt relief. Instead, unease gnawed at him. The handkerchief was too perfect, placed exactly where it would be found, bearing just enough evidence to make it irrefutable in the public eye. In his mind, he replayed the timeline. Gratham could have committed the murder. He had the physical presence, the opportunity. But the motive? The only one that fit was a vague financial dispute, and even that was second-hand gossip. More troubling was the fact that 2 witnesses had placed Gratham at the far end of the village around the time of death, though their accounts had been brushed aside amid the excitement. That night, Hartley returned to the scene alone. The lane was quiet, the moon hanging low and silver between clouds. He walked the muddy verge where the handkerchief had been found, crouching to study the ground. The earth here had been disturbed, not just by police boots, but earlier. Someone had knelt here deliberately. He spotted it, a faint indentation of a shoe, half hidden by weeds, smaller than Gratham's size and narrower like a woman's. Hartley straightened slowly, the cold damp seeping through his coat. He was certain now. The handkerchief had been planted. The next morning, Gratham sat in the interview room, his eyes sharp and amused despite the long night. "Detective Hartley," he said smoothly, "you don't believe I did this, do you?" Hartley didn't answer. "You know as well as I that I've been made the perfect villain. Wealthy, aloof, easy to dislike, and with just enough of a connection to the victim to make it plausible." Hartley leaned forward. "If you didn't do it, who did?" Gratham's smile widened, though it didn't touch his eyes. "I imagine that's the very thing you'll have to work out, but I'll give you this. Whoever it was, they're clever and patient, and they know exactly how to make you dance." Despite Hartley's doubts, the machinery of the law kept moving. Bail was denied, the newspapers revelled in the scandal, and the chief superintendent declared the case all but concluded. Yet in the quiet hours, Hartley went over the threads again. The narrow shoe print, the witness statements ignored, the small, precise contradictions in every suspect's account. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and somewhere in Weathercombe the real killer was watching it all unfold, smiling in the shadows, waiting for Hartley to make his next move. The moment Detective Hartley returned to his cramped office, the weight of the false victory hung over him, like a fog refusing to lift. The arrest of Gratham had stirred the town into a restless excitement, but for Hartley, unease grew stronger by the hour. Something was missing, a thread lost somewhere in the tangled fabric of the case. He pulled the worn file from the shelf, one he'd glanced at only once before, an old cold case from 7 years ago, buried in the archives under the label Unsolved. The file concerned a break-in at the estate of a woman named Clara Baines. Hartley flipped through the yellowed reports, noting the strange circumstances. A theft of valuable documents was reported, but no one was caught. Oddly, the police had mentioned a connection to Dr. Carter, who had been consulted to treat Mrs. Baines's nervous condition after the incident. The two had met then, but the depth of their relationship was never explored. Curious, Hartley dug deeper, cross-referencing the addresses and timelines. Mrs. Baines, the same woman who had appeared in the current investigation, had been keeping secrets longer than anyone suspected. The theft was never explained, but the missing documents were rumoured to involve a disputed inheritance and scandalous family history, something powerful enough to destroy reputations. Hartley also found a faded photograph tucked inside the file, a younger Clara Baines, standing beside a man who bore a striking resemblance to Harold Finch, the grocer. The caption read, "Clara and Harold, circa 1918. The discovery stunned him. 2 suspects, previously considered unrelated, now clearly connected by a shared past. The detective recalled Mrs. Baines's sharp tone and evident resentment toward Dr. Carter. Had the doctor stumbled upon old wounds better left closed? Had he been trying to mediate, or worse, had his intervention threatened to expose secrets someone wished to bury? To test his theory, Hartley arranged an informal meeting with Mrs. Baines. Over tea in her modest sitting room, he broached the subject gently. "Mrs. Baines, I came across a photograph showing you with Mr. Finch many years ago. Would you care to explain your connection?" Mrs. Baines's eyes flickered briefly, betraying surprise before settling into practiced calm. "That was a lifetime ago," she said softly. "Harold and I were close, yes. We had plans once, but things changed." Hartley pressed on. "Did those changes involve the documents stolen from your home, the ones that caused you distress and brought Dr. Carter into your life?" A shadow passed across her face. "I've said all I care to about that," she replied. "Some things are better left where they lie." Before Hartley could respond, the door opened quietly, and in stepped Agnes Webb, clutching a folded paper. She hesitated, then handed it over. It was a letter written in Dr. Carter's neat hand, addressed to an unknown recipient, dated just days before his death. The letter hinted at a discovery, a secret that could alter the course of several lives, and warned of dangers if it became public. The letter ended with the words, "Trust no one, not even those closest." Hartley read the note twice, the pieces falling into place like a puzzle finally clicked. The past was not a distant shadow, but a living force, pulling at the present with invisible hands. He looked up at Mrs. Baines and Agnes. "This is more than just a murder. It's a web of old betrayals and new fears, and I suspect it's far from over." The room fell into a tense silence. Outside, the day darkened with gathering clouds, as though the storm of secrets was about to break. Hartley knew one thing for certain. To solve the mystery, he would need to unravel the past as carefully as he pursued the present, and in doing so, he might discover that the dead doctor's final dream was not one of peace, but a warning. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting long, restless shadows through the leaded windows of the apothecary's upper rooms. Detective Hartley sat quietly, a small, peculiar object resting on the desk before him, a delicate glass vial, filled with a faintly shimmering liquid. It was not evidence in the traditional sense, nor was it part of any routine investigation. Rather, it was a carefully chosen instrument in an unconventional approach he hoped might reveal what the usual questions could not. Miss Marple had introduced him to the concept, one that required patience, subtlety, and a keen eye for the slightest change in manner or expression. The idea was simple: present a suspect with something seemingly unrelated, yet personally significant, then observe their reaction. Truth, it seemed, often slipped through the cracks of carefully constructed lies when faced with the unexpected. Across the room, Agnes Webb sat stiffly in a chair, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. She had agreed to meet again, though with obvious hesitation. Hartley watched as she glanced at the vial, her eyes narrowing for a moment, before settling in uncertainty. "Do you recognize this?" Hartley asked gently, holding the vial up to catch the last rays of light. Agnes's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she glanced away, a faint flush creeping into her cheeks. "It's a tincture of valerian and lavender," Hartley explained. "Dr. Carter used it often, said it helped with restless sleep and troubled dreams. I believe you knew that." She nodded, but her eyes were wary now. "Yes, he kept it locked away." Hartley allowed a pause, then leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Agnes, did you ever notice if the doctor's dreams, the ones he wrote down, were affected by this tincture? Did it soothe them, or did they grow darker?" Her fingers clenched together for a heartbeat. "I don't know," she whispered. "Sometimes, after he took it, he seemed more distracted, like he was chasing something in his mind." "And did you ever dream, Agnes?" Hartley asked softly. "Dreams can be dangerous things. They reveal more than we sometimes wish to admit." Agnes swallowed hard, her composure slipping. "Yes," she confessed. "I had a dream once, about a key. A silver key, but not the one found with the doctor. Another one. It opened a door I couldn't see beyond." Hartley's eyes sharpened. "That's very interesting. You see, I've been thinking about keys, not just the physical kind, but the ones that unlock secrets in people's hearts." He let the words hang in the air, watching her carefully. Suddenly her composure fractured. She looked up, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "There's more than one box," she said hurriedly. "Another box, the one the doctor was most afraid of. I never meant for any of this to happen." Hartley remained silent, letting her speak. "The second box. It's hidden where no one thought to look. The doctor tried to protect it, but someone found out, someone dangerous. The room felt colder, the weight of her admission settling heavily between them. Hartley nodded slowly. "Thank you, Agnes. You've taken a brave step." As she rose to leave, her face was still pale but resolute. Hartley knew this was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, not a piece of physical evidence, but a crack in the carefully woven facade of silence and fear. Outside, the day was fading, but inside that small room, the shadows were receding just enough for the truth to begin its slow, cautious emergence. The morning air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant sea breeze through the open window of the small evidence room at the Wethercombe police station. Detective Hartley entered with a sense of purpose, clutching a small, leather-bound notebook he'd taken from Dr. Carter's desk the previous day. The notebook contained the doctor's dreams, his cryptic writings, and what Hartley now believed to be the key to unraveling the tangled mystery. He set the book carefully on the evidence table, taking a moment to study its worn cover before opening it to the marked pages. As he read through the strange, poetic descriptions, the labyrinthine gardens, the silver key, the locked boxes, Hartley felt a growing certainty that the doctor had been trying to warn someone, or perhaps himself, of the danger lurking beneath the surface of St. Aldwyth's quiet streets. Intent on sharing the notebook's significance with Miss Marple and the constable, Hartley was interrupted by a sudden, sharp knock on the door. It was Constable Jarvis, his face pale and anxious. "Detective, you'll want to see this." Hartley followed Jarvis down the corridor to the evidence storage room. The door, normally locked with a heavy iron bolt, was ajar. Inside, the atmosphere was unsettlingly empty. The small box where the notebook had been placed was gone. So too were several other items taken from the doctor's desk: letters, a silver key, and the vial of tincture that Agnes had mentioned. Hartley's heart sank. Someone had broken in during the night, bypassing the station's meagre security to remove what could only be described as the heart of the case. "Who had access?" Hartley demanded, turning to Jarvis. "Only a handful of us," Jarvis replied, rubbing his neck nervously. "But no one noticed anything unusual last night. The night watchman was asleep when I checked just before dawn. Miss Marple arrived soon after, her keen eyes sweeping the room. She knelt by the empty box's place, noting the faint scratch marks on the wooden surface where it had once rested. "This is no ordinary theft," she murmured. "Someone wanted to bury the truth, or at least delay its discovery." The detective agreed. "And they're watching us, Miss Marple. Every step we take, every clue we find, it's as if they anticipate our moves." The loss of the notebook was a blow, but Hartley refused to surrender. He began retracing the chain of custody, questioning every officer and clerk who had been near the evidence. Yet no one seemed to have seen or heard anything. Tensions grew. Trust, always a fragile commodity in such investigations, began to fray among the team. Accusations, though unspoken, hung in the air like a thick fog. That evening, Hartley and Miss Marple convened quietly in the apothecary's back room. Over cups of steaming tea, they pored over the scraps of information that remained. Miss Marple's fingers traced a pattern in the dust on the table. The thief knew exactly what to take. This was a calculated strike. "Someone close," Hartley said. "Someone who understands the significance of the evidence." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And someone desperate to keep the past buried." As the night deepened, the stakes became clear. The truth was no longer just a puzzle. It was a prize being fiercely guarded. And the closer they came to uncovering it, the more dangerous the game would become. Outside, the village lay quiet, but inside hearts beat faster with the knowledge that in Wethercombe shadows were gathering, and they were closing in fast. The night settled thick and heavy over Wethercombe, swallowing the narrow lanes and shuttered windows in an uneasy silence. Detective Hartley had just returned from a late meeting with Miss Marple at the apothecary, their heads bent close over the scattered fragments of a puzzle growing more elusive by the day. Exhausted but determined, he crossed the cobblestones toward the station when a sudden commotion stopped him in his tracks. Voices, sharp, urgent, carried from the edge of town, near the old mill where the river whispered secrets through the broken sluice gates. Hartley's hand went instinctively to his coat pocket, where the small notebook once kept by Dr. Carter should have been but was no longer. The loss of that vital evidence still gnawed at him, a silent reminder that the truth was slipping through their fingers. He hurried toward the source of the noise, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. By the time he reached the mill's edge, constables were gathered around a small figure huddled against the crumbling stone wall, a young man known to the village as Thomas Finch, Harold Finch's estranged nephew. His face was pale and streaked with tears, eyes wide with shock. "It's Uncle Harold," Thomas gasped. "He's gone. They found him in the woods beyond the river. Dead." The words hit Hartley like a blow. Harold Finch, the grocer, a man already under suspicion, was now the victim of a brutal murder. The news sent ripples through the town the following morning. Finch's body had been discovered lying face down beneath a tangled thicket, a single wound to the back of his head. There were no signs of robbery, no immediate clue as to who might have wanted him silenced. The villagers whispered nervously. The fragile sense of closure that had begun with Gratham's arrest evaporated overnight. For Hartley, the murder was more than a complication. It was a message. The killer was still at large, and their reach was longer and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple was already at the station, waiting with her usual calm demeanour, but eyes sharp as ever. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "It proves our adversary is watching us closely, willing to strike again to protect their secrets." Hartley nodded, running a hand through his hair. "And it means they know we're close to uncovering something they want buried." The detective's mind raced as he reviewed Finch's known associates and recent activities. Had Finch discovered something new, or had he been a pawn all along, sacrificed to mislead or intimidate? Then came the most chilling detail. Finch had been seen arguing heatedly with Mrs. Baines just days before his death. Witnesses reported raised voices near the market square, their words lost to the crowd, but their anger unmistakable. Hartley and Miss Marple arranged to speak with Mrs. Baines immediately. When confronted, her composure cracked just slightly, a fleeting shadow passing over her features before she composed herself. "Harold and I had our disagreements," she admitted, "but I would never harm him." Her eyes, however, betrayed a storm beneath the surface, a mixture of guilt, fear, and something unreadable. As the investigation spiraled deeper into old grievances and hidden alliances, Hartley received an anonymous note slipped under his door at the station. It was brief, chilling. "Stop digging, or you'll be next." The detective's pulse quickened. The game had grown deadly serious. That night, as Hartley locked the station doors and prepared to leave, a sudden noise in the shadows made him spin around. A figure darted from the darkness, knocking him to the ground before disappearing into the night. Bruised but unbroken, Hartley realized the warning was no idle threat. The killer was closer than ever, and the race to uncover the truth had become a fight for survival. In the days that followed, the investigation would take turns no one expected, the fragile threads of trust unraveling as secrets long buried clawed their way back to the surface. And as the shadows closed in, Hartley knew that solving the mystery was no longer enough. He had to stop the next murder before it was too late. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the cobblestones of Weathercombe, softening the edges of buildings and muffling the sounds of the waking village. Detective Hartley stood near the apothecary's doorstep, the chill seeping through his coat as he mulled over the recent upheavals, the murders, the stolen evidence, the anonymous threats. The tangled web seemed to tighten with every new discovery, yet amid the chaos his mind clawed for a thread to follow. He found it unexpectedly in a detail that had seemed trivial before, the old silver thimble Mrs. Lathbury had shown him days earlier. It was an odd keepsake, tarnished but intricately engraved, one of the doctor's personal effects, discovered in a drawer he'd never thought to search closely. At the time it had seemed an insignificant relic, perhaps a souvenir or a family heirloom. Yet something about its delicate craftsmanship, and a faint trace of lavender oil, had lodged in Hartley's mind. Back at the station, Hartley spread out the case files once more, his fingers tracing the names, dates, and fragments of testimony. It was then that Miss Marple's words from their last meeting echoed softly in his thoughts. "Truth is often hidden where no one bothers to look." He flipped through the notebook fragments recovered before the theft, paying special attention to the doctor's descriptions of dreams. One entry mentioned a silver needle guarding the gate, a metaphor that now seemed less poetic and more literal. Hartley's mind returned to the thimble. He revisited Mrs. Lathbury's shop, where she greeted him with a cautious smile. "You wanted to know more about that thimble?" she asked. "Yes," Hartley said. "It's a fine piece, but I'm curious why the doctor kept it among his medicines." Mrs. Lathbury's eyes flickered. "It belonged to his mother. She was a seamstress, and the thimble was her lucky charm. The doctor kept it close for comfort, and sometimes to remind him of simpler times." "Do you know if anyone else might have had access to it?" Hartley asked. "Only a few," she replied. "Agnes, mostly. She was trusted to care for his belongings when he was away." A sudden thought struck Hartley. If Agnes had access to the thimble, might it have been used as a signal, or a key to something hidden? He sought her out, finding Agnes at the apothecary. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed him a folded piece of cloth. "I didn't think it meant much," she admitted. "But Dr. Carter once hid a note inside this thimble case." Hartley unfolded the cloth carefully, revealing a small, yellowed slip of paper. The writing was cramped, but legible. A map, of sorts, showing the apothecary's floor plan with a tiny X marked beneath the floorboards near the fireplace. Returning to the apothecary, Hartley knelt beside the hearth, running his fingers along the wooden floor. With a tentative push, one of the planks shifted, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside lay a small, locked box, the very one missing from the desk drawer. The box was old but sturdy, and on its lid was engraved the same intricate pattern as the silver thimble. Heart pounding, Hartley produced the thimble and fitted it against a tiny hidden latch. With a soft click, the box opened, revealing its contents: letters, faded photographs, and a leather-bound diary. The diary belonged to Dr. Carter's mother. Within its pages were secrets, family disputes over inheritance, long-buried betrayals, and names that matched those tangled in the present mystery. Finch, Baines, even Gratham. It was a revelation. The past was not only linked to the present, but had been carefully concealed through generations, the motive for murder wrapped tightly around family legacy and long-standing grudges. Hartley looked up as Miss Marple entered quietly, her eyes bright with understanding. "The pieces are coming together," she said softly. "The thimble, the box, the dreams. They all point to a truth that was always beneath our feet." As the fog lifted from Wethercombe's streets, so too did the haze over the case begin to clear. The pattern had emerged, not from the loudest clues or the grandest theories, but from the smallest, most overlooked detail. And with it came the hope that the shadows could finally be dispelled, revealing the murderer waiting to be unmasked. The late afternoon light filtered through the heavy curtains of the village hall, casting muted patterns on the polished wooden floor. Detective Hartley sat across from Mrs. Baines, the room thick with a tension that had grown over the weeks like a slow-burning fire. At last, the final pieces were falling into place, and the truth behind Dr. Carter's death loomed nearer than ever. Mrs. Baines's hands trembled slightly as she folded a handkerchief in her lap, her eyes fixed on a distant spot above Hartley's shoulder. "You want to know why," she said softly. "Why I hated him so much." Her voice wavered, betraying years of hidden pain. Hartley leaned forward, his gaze steady but gentle. "Please, Mrs. Baines, it's time." She took a deep breath, then began. It wasn't about money, or property, or even revenge in the usual sense. Her eyes glistened now, tears threatening to spill. It was about fear. About the fear of losing everything that defined me. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Years ago, before anyone here knew Dr. Carter, I was a different woman. Married to a man who promised love but gave me only chains. Harold Finch was my closest friend then. My only friend. Together we dreamed of escaping, of starting fresh. Her gaze darkened. But those dreams shattered when the truth came out. A secret from my past, a mistake I thought was buried, was found by Dr. Carter's mother, who wrote in her diary about it. That diary, it wasn't just pages of family history, it was a weapon. Hartley felt a chill. "So the doctor's mother exposed you?" Mrs. Baines nodded. "She threatened to reveal what could ruin me, my youth, my choices, my freedom. Dr. Carter inherited that burden. He knew everything, and he believed he could save me by controlling the story. But his methods were cruel, cold experiments with my mind, trying to unravel the past through dreams and fear. She swallowed hard. I was terrified, not just of exposure, but of losing who I was. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't plan to kill him, but when I saw him pushing further, threatening to bring the past into the open, I felt trapped, and that fear, it consumed me. Hartley regarded her thoughtfully. The crime was not merely transactional, but deeply personal, a desperate act by someone cornered by secrets and haunted by the shadows of her own life. And the second murder? He asked carefully. Mrs. Baines's eyes flickered. Harold, he found out I was involved. He confronted me. I never meant to silence him, but fear makes fools of us all. Hartley nodded slowly. The tangled web of motives had been more than greed or power. It had been a psychological prison built on fear, shame, and the unbearable weight of past sins. As the interview ended, Miss Marple appeared quietly at the door, her expression serene but knowing. The deepest motives, she said softly, are often hidden beneath layers no one dares to peel away until the very end. The village of Wethercombe would soon learn that behind the facade of polite society lay scars far darker than any had imagined, wounds that had driven a woman to the unthinkable and bound them all in a story of secrets, betrayal, and the fragile human heart. The village hall was empty save for a single flickering candle on the oak table, its wavering light casting tall shadows against the walls. Detective Hartley stood near the hearth, his eyes steady and clear, the weight of the past week settling into a calm resolve. Across from him, Mrs. Baines sat stiffly, the faint tremor in her hands betraying the mask of composure she wore so carefully. Mrs. Baines, Hartley began quietly, we've come a long way together. I know the truth has been a heavy burden, but tonight you can choose to lighten it. He folded his hands on the table. There's no need for further suffering. She met his gaze, the storm within her eyes now a tempest barely held at bay. You think you have me cornered, detective, but you don't know what I'm capable of. Hartley's voice remained calm. I know enough. I know how fear drove you to do terrible things, but I also know there's a chance to make amends. He gestured to the door. You don't have to be alone in this. For a moment, silence filled the room like a thick fog. Then Mrs. Baines rose abruptly, her chair scraping sharply against the floor. You think you can save me? Save what's left of me? Her voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. I was never meant to be saved. She took a step toward the window. The night beyond a velvet black, and for a heartbeat it seemed she might escape into the darkness. But Hartley was ready. With a swift movement, he reached into his coat and produced the diary, the doctor's mother's diary, the key to unraveling the entire web of secrets. It's over, Clara. The past is out. The truth is in these pages. Mrs. Baines's eyes flickered to the leather-bound book, then back to Hartley. The walls closed in. Her shoulders sagged as if a great weight had finally been released. I wanted to protect us all. From ruin. From disgrace. But I see now I only spread pain. Hartley stepped closer, his tone gentle but firm. Your actions can still bring justice and peace. Confessing is the first step. Tears welled in her eyes, and with a shuddering breath she nodded. You're right. Before Hartley could move to escort her, a sudden noise shattered the fragile calm, a loud crash from the rear of the hall. A shadow darted past the doorway, an attempt to flee. Hartley's heart raced, the killer's final gambit. He pursued swiftly, catching the figure near the stairs. It was Agnes Webb, clutching a small bundle tightly to her chest. I couldn't let you ruin everything, she whispered, voice trembling. He trusted me. I had to protect his secrets. Hartley's gaze softened but remained resolute. Secrets kept in darkness only breed more pain. It's time to bring everything into the light. As the dawn broke over Wethercombe, the village awoke to the truth laid bare. The tangled web of fear, love, betrayal, and redemption had finally been untangled, thanks to steady eyes and patient hearts. And as Hartley looked toward the rising sun, he knew that sometimes the deepest wounds could begin to heal when faced honestly, and that justice, like light, had a way of finding even the darkest corners. The village hall had emptied, the echoes of confessions and farewells fading into the crisp morning air. Detective Hartley stood alone by the window, watching the first rays of sunlight spill over Weathercomb's rooftops, feeling the case finally slip into the realm of closure. The arrest had been made, the motives uncovered, and justice was poised to take its course, or so he thought. A soft knock broke the silence behind him. Miss Marple entered quietly, her eyes holding a new, unreadable light. In her hand she held a folded piece of parchment, worn at the edges but carefully preserved. "Detective," she began, "there is something you must see, something that changes everything." Hartley's curiosity sharpened as she handed him the parchment. It was a letter, written in a hurried, slanted script, undated, unsigned, but unmistakably from Dr. Carter himself. The letter spoke of a secret experiment, one that involved much more than the tangled family disputes and hidden wills. It hinted at a plan to manipulate memories, to alter perceptions of reality, and to protect certain truths by bending minds, a psychological web woven deep into the fabric of the village's quiet surface, and at the heart of it, Dr. Carter warned of a figure, a puppeteer lurking behind the scenes, orchestrating events with cold calculation. Someone who had used fear and deceit as tools, pulling strings unseen. Hartley's mind reeled. The carefully laid motives of Mrs. Baines and Agnes now seemed part of a larger, more insidious design. Who was this mastermind? Who had been manipulating the shadows all along? He returned to the village, retracing steps, questioning faces anew. It was then a small, seemingly insignificant detail, a habitual tapping of fingers during interviews, that caught his attention. It belonged to Constable Jarvis, a man long trusted and overlooked. The tapping was nervous but deliberate, a rhythm echoing faintly in Hartley's memory. Confronting Jarvis quietly, Hartley observed as the constable's facade cracked. Under the weight of the new evidence and steady questioning, Jarvis confessed. He had been manipulating the investigation from the start, directing suspicion away from himself while fueling the chaos. His motive was a twisted blend of ambition and revenge, born from years of resentment and a desire to control the narrative. The revelation sent shockwaves through the village. The trusted officer who had guarded the evidence, who had seemed a pillar of order, was the true architect of the turmoil. Hartley felt the full weight of the case settle once more. Justice was never simple. It was layered with deception and human frailty. Yet, in the end, clarity emerged from the deepest shadows. As Jarvis was led away, head bowed but eyes defiant, Hartley and Miss Marple exchanged a knowing glance. The mystery had finally unravelled, not with a single truth, but with the patience to see beyond appearances and the courage to face the unexpected. Weathercomb's streets were quiet again, but beneath the calm, a lesson lingered. Sometimes the greatest danger lies not in the obvious suspect, but in the quiet watcher standing just out of sight. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with anticipation and the faint scent of old wood and polished brass. Detective Hartley sat near the prosecution's table, his eyes steady and sharp, watching as the final moments of the trial unfolded. The weight of weeks, of twists, confessions and betrayals, had led to this moment. Justice, it seemed, was within reach. The judge's gavel struck once, calling the court to order as the prosecution laid out the evidence with careful precision. The diary, the letters, the recovered box, all threads woven into a tapestry of motive and opportunity that pointed unmistakably to Mrs. Baines and Agnes Webb. Their roles had been clear, desperation and fear driving one, loyalty and secrecy binding the other. Yet, as the defense attorney rose to deliver the closing argument, Hartley sensed a subtle shift, a clever weave of doubt and misdirection aimed at unsettling the jury's certainty. The defense painted the case as a tragedy born of human frailty, not criminal intent, casting shadows on the reliability of the key evidence, especially the tampered notebook and the stolen vial. When the verdict was announced, guilty on lesser charges but not murder, the courtroom stirred with murmurs. Justice, it seemed, had been served only in part. After the proceedings, Hartley met Miss Marple outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows behind them. "The law is a complex thing," she murmured, "and sometimes it must settle for a balance rather than certainty." Hartley nodded. "But the truth goes deeper. There were clues no one else saw, or chose to ignore." He pulled from his coat pocket a small silver thimble, its intricate engraving catching the fading light. This was overlooked at the time, a keepsake, yes, but also a silent witness. The faint scent of lavender on it linked not only to Dr. Carter's remedies, but to the place where the real secret was hidden. That, combined with the subtle shoe prints and the handwriting variations in the diary, told a story of collaboration and betrayal that no single confession could capture. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes justice in the eyes of the law is just the beginning. The rest falls to those who watch closely." Yet as the village settled into uneasy calm, a whisper of doubt lingered. The mastermind's full reach had never been fully uncovered, and a shadowy figure, silent and unseen, still roamed beyond the edges of the investigation. Hartley returned to the scene one last time, standing beneath the elm-lined lane where it had all begun. The wind stirred the fallen leaves at his feet, carrying with it the faintest trace of lavender and something darker, unfinished business. The case was closed, but the echoes remained. In Wethercombe, as in life, some truths are forever just out of reach, and some justice, like the fading light, slips quietly into shadow. The sun dipped low beyond the rolling hills surrounding Wethercombe, painting the sky with hues of amber and rose as Detective Hartley strolled along the narrow village lane. The autumn breeze whispered softly through the trees, stirring fallen leaves in a lazy dance that seemed to echo the restless thoughts in his mind. The case that had consumed weeks of his life was officially closed, yet something lingered, a shadow that refused to settle. He paused beside the ancient stone wall that bordered the old apothecary's garden, fingers tracing the rough surface as memories surfaced like ghosts. The tangled web of secrets, betrayals, and confessions had unravelled neatly in the public eye, but Hartley knew better. Truth was rarely so tidy. Beneath the surface, beneath the final verdicts and faded headlines, a subtle puzzle piece remained misplaced. Earlier that day, during the court proceedings, a curious detail had caught his attention. A seemingly inconsequential remark from the defense attorney about a third key, dismissed by most as a metaphor. But Hartley recalled the doctor's dreams, cryptic as they were, speaking of keys not just physical but symbolic. And in the diary, among the carefully inked lines, was a phrase almost smudged beyond recognition. "The silent witness watches still." His thoughts returned to the silver thimble, its intricate engraving now more than a keepsake, a symbol of a past that refused to be forgotten. Was there truly a third key? A secret yet undiscovered, held by an unseen player whose presence had been felt but never fully grasped? Hartley's gaze lifted toward the village's edge, where the dense woodlands curled dark and mysterious. From there came the faintest sound, a twig snapping underfoot, or perhaps just the echo of a restless night. The detective's lips curved in a subtle smile. The game was not over. As twilight deepened, he reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a small folded note, tucked away earlier in the investigation, and nearly lost amidst the chaos. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message brief and enigmatic. "Look beyond what is shown. The path lies where shadows meet." He folded the note carefully, slipping it back into his pocket as a figure appeared on the distant path, a solitary silhouette watching from the dusk, unseen but unmistakably present. Detective Hartley adjusted his hat against the cooling air and resumed his walk, footsteps steady and purposeful. The village's quiet streets awaited their guardian, and the mysteries that threaded through its heart promised more stories to tell. For in Wethercombe, as in all places where secrets linger, one truth remained eternal. A mystery never truly ends. It only waits for the next keen eye, the next curious mind, to breathe it back to life. And Hartley was ready.